Good evening. I'm Henry Farini. I'm here with Peter Almond.
Hi.
And we're doing this is a first for the Writer Center. I'm glad we have Lance here, who's helping out, making sure that this technology is working properly, because that is not my forte. And Liz is over here taking pictures, but she's being really good about keeping the 6-foot rule. I can't do that because I need to be next to the microphone over here. But we're respecting as much personal space as we can. I'm happy if everybody has tuned in here at the Maud Olson Library. This evening, Peter came here maybe last fall, or was it
late summer?
Late summer, to check out the Maud Olson Library and do some work, and he's been here off and on working. He is a documentary filmmaker and a narrative filmmaker, and his career includes the work of on public issues as a journalist and in public policy with both the U.S. and in international projects as well. His current work includes a drama in the lead up to the Civil War, when Frederick Douglass abandons hope of a moral/political solution in ending slavery, and concludes that the war is the only way to resolve the crisis and the nation's embrace of inequality. So that's why he came here to check out sort of Olson's stuff, because as I know that as a younger man, he was interested in Charles Olson. So he's been back and forth at the library, and we've been happy to have him hang out at Olson's table. And now we have him laid out here in front of Facebook to talk to everyone. He's going to. So Peter has this narrative streak and this documentary streak, and he has his writerly streak as well. One of the things that I find interesting about Peter's work is he has a background in community organizing and policy around community control, initiatives framed by power to communities suffering injustice. So I think that's clearly how he ended up with Frederick Douglass. But his work has been international in scope as well, in Ukraine, Hungary, and the U.S. We're really excited that we have this situation to let him speak about his work, and I'm going to just pass it over to Peter.
Thanks, Henry. I'm really grateful to a number of hosts here in Gloucester. My original hosts here, and what brought me to Gloucester, are great old friends, novelists Jay Cantor and Melinda Marble, who is currently executive director of the McGovern Foundation, and it's not in its first year, but she's just recently taken on the leadership there. So I got to Gloucester, and a little perch overlooking Annisquam off Washington Street about late summer, and I found my way to Maud Olson. Now, I got to Olson early in my life. I can't date it exactly, but right around the end of college, somebody gave me, or said I have to call me Ishmael, and really the first sentence, I think, in Ishmael sort of hooked me, and I want to read that. Olson writes, "I take space to be the central fact to person born in America. Americans still fancy themselves such democrats, but their triumphs are of the machine. I've ellipsis there a little bit, but he goes on to Melville. It was not the will to be free, but the will to overwhelm nature that lies at the bottom of us as individuals and a people. Ahab is no Democrat. Moby Dick, antagonist, is only king of natural force resource. Now that passage,
Right there in that sentence.
I've cut several together, but that sort of hooked me to Olson. But I'm not a scholar. I followed Olson over the course of my years, collected various volumes, but I never. It was sort of a dream someday to come to Gloucester and see eventually where he ended up and what this Gloucester was that so sparked Olson's imagination. And that brought me to Maud Olson Library just hardly 2 seasons ago. And Henry has hosted me here, Amanda Cook. Who else? I think Ellen Pulitzer, is that your
Right, Ellen's works
also
here.
was a staff person who helped out. Anyway, I've had nothing but warm welcome here. Now, I want to come back to Olson, but I want to leave that for the moment. And I want to explain why I'm going to ask our followers tonight if you can make your way to the first film clip, and I'll explain briefly why I want to jump from Gloucester Olson to Kiev in the Ukraine in 1989.
Спят стройные сосны. Встает яркое солнце. Я
Не подходи. Может, это опасно. На атомный взрыв. Срочно спасай детей. Прощай.
Толя! Толя, куда ты? Ребята, урок окончен. Быстренько собирайте вещи и все расходитесь по домам.
Вы куда? А ну-ка всем живо вернуться в класс! Что вы делаете? Кто вам позволил прекратить занятия?
На станции взрыв. Нужно немедленно всех отправить по домам. Вы что, сумасшедшие? Хотите погубить детей?
Ну-ка прекратите игру! Ну-ка, марш все по домам! Я кому сказал, ребята? Послушайте! Остановите! Немедленно расходитесь по домам! Отбирайте детей со двора! Заберите форточку! Ну опомнитесь, товарищи! Оставаться на улице опасно! Ну неужели же вы не знаете, что случилось?
Чего? Кто вам позволил сеять панику среди людей?
А что, в такой ситуации нужно ждать каких-то особых распоряжений?
Какой такой ситуации?
Вы что, сумасшедший? Вы не знаете, что произошло?
Ничего не произошло. Кто вам дал право лишать людей праздничного настроения в субботу? Намечено 20 свадеб. Все 20 и отыграем.
that's quite timely to be watching that scene during this lockdown in our country from a virus that is as invisible as that radiation was to those people at Chernobyl.
Well, right. Just to back up a little, in 1989, I went to Kiev to visit my parents. My dad was a visiting professor at the State University of Ukraine in Kiev, teaching democratic theory for the first time in Soviet history, that things had opened up enough that then Soviet Ukrainians could hear about democratic theory in comparison to communism. And somehow the word got out. My folks had gotten to know a number of people in Kiev that an American filmmaker was in town, and literally within a day, scripts started to come through over the transom and greet me in the lobby of the hotel, and one of them was RASPAD. And as I read it, obviously in English translation, I couldn't believe my eyes. I had all the kind of understandings of restrictions on expression in Soviet Union, and Ukraine was still, of course, very much part of the Soviet Union. But here the filmmakers were describing betrayal and corruption at the highest level by party officials, by government officials, as you saw in the clip, I hope, and if not, the clip shows the mayor coming out and telling the surgeon who has encountered what obviously is, he knows is radiation effects of the Chernobyl explosion, and he's urging the kids and the people going to these public weddings on the weekend, the Easter weekend, to go home and shut your windows and take all precautions. And the mayor is saying, who gives you the right to say that? We're going on with as usual. It's Easter weekend in Ukraine, and there are Easter parades, bicycle races going on, and the government wants everything to go on as before. So the very idea of the courage of these filmmakers to buck the government, and they were part of the Soviet film ministry called Goskino. It just, I was quite struck by the boldness of their vision, and I saw some of the work these filmmakers had made, and I agreed to help them bring the film to life and to eventually bring it to the US or international distribution. And that began what became a 3-year process of making the film, finding financing, getting it launched. It played in Cannes, it played in Toronto Film Festival, in Venice, and it had international theatrical distribution, which is making a long story short of what happened. But I wanted to show that clip that shows this.
Did it show in the U.S.?
Yes, it had a theatrical release in the U.S. in what we used to call art houses. Yeah. So in Cambridge, it was at the Coolidge, not in Cambridge, but wherever the Coolidge.
Yeah, Brookline.
Brookline.
Yeah.
In New York, it was at Lincoln Plaza and so forth. So the film was made as the opening that Gorbachev had brought about through the loosening of communist controls in what was called perestroika, and in international terms was called glasnost, a kind of opening to the world, which allowed for, in the film case, international co-production. So literally, as we were making the film was financed by the Soviet film ministry, Goskino, but as things were moving so quickly in the former Soviet Union, at that coincidental to the film, people were allowed to create their own businesses, and my Ukrainian colleagues bought the rights back, literally as we were filming, bought the rights to the film back from the Soviet ministry, owned it themselves. We had to renegotiate all of our contracts with them, but we were sort of watching their history unfold as this remarkable opening occurred, and the result was that we continued on, and their original dream in technological terms was to have a Dolby sound as part of their mix. They didn't have that technology at that time. They were very advanced in cinematography and techniques, and Russian cinema is extraordinary, but they didn't have Dolby sound. So we fulfilled that dream by bringing, once we'd finished production, the entire post was done at Skywalker Ranch in West Marin County with 15 Ukrainian film men and women came over for 2 months, and we did the entire mix in the Lucas studio facility, and it ended up working out. I should explain that in that same set of URL links that Lance has put in the comment section, you'll see at the bottom of that list are what I called readings, and there are a couple of comments from there are a couple of articles that I posted there, one by a New York Times Moscow bureau chief who interviewed us and wrote about how the film picks up these themes of both the urge for independence and the kind of democratic impulse that was, or the independence impulse that Chernobyl, the crisis, had put kind of in motion. 3 years earlier than when we were filming, when Chernobyl actually exploded, that was sort of the beginning of a very active so-called Green Party independence movement in Ukraine. And anyway, the article by the Times Moscow bureau chief picks up on those ideas. So for your background reading, if you're interested, I posted that, and I think the LA Times review of the film, which I thought was very thoughtful and picks up on a lot of the themes I'm mentioning here about independence and so forth. But it was truly the film was a kind of mini indie epic. I've shown you, Henry, and we can go to a short clip of the evacuation of the engineer city, which we recreated with 500 buses. I'm not kidding. Actually 500 buses and 5,000 extras. So we had people reenacting, and they did it in the spirit of kind of citizen responsibility. They wanted to tell the story of their experience of Chernobyl and bring to the world, as participants in this process, the experience of Chernobyl and why it had to be seen as part of why the Ukrainian citizenry wanted independence from the Soviet Union. They wanted autonomy as a state, and they wanted to bring about environmental, ecological principles that would protect them. I was part of rallies in the main Kreshadek, the main street of Kiev, where they linked arms all the way from Kiev to Kharkov, you know, as a statement of independence, and the filmmakers were right in the middle of it. And I'll bring this anecdote to an end with one anecdote. We actually had to take a break in filming for 2 weeks while our director, Mikhail Belikov, who was the head of the Cinematographers Union of Ukraine, had been made a member of the Duma, of the National Congress, in this sort of fast-moving, reconfiguring, still Gorbachev era. The wall hadn't yet quite fallen. And he went up and took his place in Moscow for 2 weeks in the Congress, and where they were voting on various reforms. And by the time we had finished, midway through, before they came to the U.S. for post-production, the wall had fallen, and so events just took off from there.
And you're still in touch with those filmmakers? And
I am in touch. Mikhail passed away in 2012. He actually did contract radiation sickness as a result of our filming. In fact, he was a cinematographer by training, and our DP, our cinematographer, had fear of heights, and we did elaborate helicopter scenes over Chernobyl and over Pripyat, the city of engineers, as it was known. And we were shooting 35 millimeter film, and so you had to land the helicopter to change magazines. And Mikhail Belikov at that time got radiation sickness. He overcame it, but he died later of cancer, and no doubt there was a connection to this. But he died 8 years ago. But some of the others I have seen as recently as this past January. I'll refer to two other projects that have Russian and Soviet connection. My first narrative film that I wrote and produced was directed by a exile emigre Russian director in 1980, and that he was a Jewish Russian. And he left in the mid-70s flood of Jewish immigration from former Soviet Union. And he and I worked in New York and on a film called A Private Life. And in the readings, there's it was picked up by the Museum of Modern Art. It's a short narrative, but the MoMA picked it up for their circulating library and collection.
На мосту самый высокий уровень. Приказываю разгонять колонну за 300 метров и проходить мост без остановок.
Действуй! Всего на 2-3 дня. Берите наше сюда, на природу, в автобусе все объясним. Мальчик, ты почему не выходишь?
Мамку жду.
А где твоя мама?
Она с Марикой поехала в деревню картошку сажать.
А папа где?
Он еще с работы не пришел.
Давай, собирайся и выходи. Маму мы встретим по дороге. Я тебя жду. Граждане, еще раз повторяю, только самое необходимое. На 2-3 дня. Поторапливайтесь.
Well, in fact, we pick up the mom later in a scene at the airport where you see a bunch of limousines bringing the party apparatchik to flee Kiev, and along with a hospital plane that's taking people who are sick, and one of the people who is getting put on the plane is the boy's mom, who's already deathly ill with the radiation.
Maybe I think the next time you're back here, when this particular situation may not be hanging over our heads, we could screen the whole film at the Writers' Center and have
talk about it.
That would be,
well, the one connection I would draw, I just on today's headlines, as I hear Trump call the virus the Chinese virus and engage in that kind of xenophobia and racism and provocative language. I mean, I think we should call it the Trump virus, because less than 2 weeks ago, Trump was denying that we had a problem, or that come April, it would just sort of he used the word magically disappear. And who knows how many lives were cost as a result of that kind of irresponsibility and trying to sort of wish it away, and now take claim that he knew that we had a pandemic, before everybody. So I'd be happy to show it when you like.
cool.
Next.
Yeah, so what's next is, well, do you want to move into what's happening, what brought you to this
place
room that you've been...
Well, I'll tell you I'll tell you a story. One of the first books that you shared with me about Olson is this Charles Bohr's study called Charles Olson in Connecticut, and I'm a little I'm reluctant to describe the effect that had on me. Olson, in his last year, goes to visit a friend at Storrs at the University of Connecticut, this author, Charles Bohr, and Olson behaves so miserably, kind of takes over this poor guy's life, makes him actually sick. And he's so boorish. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why Olson was larger than life, as we all know. And it had the effect on me, though, that it kind of turned me off a little bit, off Olson. It was such a beautiful and painful account, and it ends with Olson's death. He becomes deathly ill in Storrs. He's in the hospital in Hartford and Manchester, and then eventually they try to get him to New York, where he dies. Anyway, I had to sort of regroup a little bit in my thoughts and feelings about Olson, but for sure I have followed out this sort of democratic impulse that pulses through Olson's work, his love and passion and resistance that he's expressing in his letters to the newspaper about the tampering with.
When you mentioned resistance, and I think that's in here. It's one of my faves.
As I made my way back, I made my peace with Olson, and I had the comfort and encouragement and stimulation of this wonderful library resource that Gloucester Writers Center operates here in the Maud Olson collection. It actually stimulated me to go back to the very beginning of my community organizing work, which began at New Haven Connecticut and in New York. And I came up with a project that I'm now proposing to spend another year researching, which grew out of a wonderful opportunity I had as a filmmaker and as maybe as an activist or advocate. A group of New York historians at the City University of New York Graduate Center were part of the breakthrough in the study of American history that was looking at emancipation and Reconstruction in a kind of a new light. This was in the course of the early to mid 70s, 1970s. And Eric Foner was then at Columbia writing his breakthrough work about Reconstruction. And the group at CUNY was working with a new project that was taking the Freedmen's Bureau Archive, which was an astonishing collection of work done on the ground in the early Reconstruction era, so immediately after the Civil War. In effect, federal U.S. Army people were deployed in effect as social workers throughout the South to help in the transformation from slavery to the new life that freed people would lead. And these documents had they'd been there since the Civil War, post-Civil War period, but they hadn't, except for W.E.B. Du Bois, they had not been studied systematically and analyzed and interpreted. And this group of historians, and it was going on around the country, kind of as an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. I mean, it was the scholarly expression of the rights of freed people, of what freedom meant to the freed, which is what the expression that they followed. And I became part of that group as a filmmaker, communicator, and we developed a pilot for a 6-hour PBS series and a dramatic interpretation by the brilliant American film director and writer Charles Burnett. And I've included that screenplay also on the list. It is a classic screenplay called In the Land of the Living. And it, in brief, the narrative is about a runaway slave who has joined the Union forces and by the end of the war returns to his village plantation in Georgia to reconfigure his family from slavery time. And of course, they have, in retribution for his running away, his owners, former owners, have sold all of his relatives to the four winds. And he goes on an odyssey through the war-torn South in an attempt to find his partner or wife, their children, and so forth. And it takes him through the kind of remarkable experimental new community creation that was the real sign of the best of Reconstruction, where freed people very quickly upon gaining freedom set about creating their own institutions, putting their families back together, starting businesses, farms, land, getting into politics. And that, so In the Land of the Living was a project that we did under Corporation for Public Broadcasting support, and it never got financed for production. So I brought it to my Hollywood company with which I was affiliated at the time, and still am, called Beacon Pictures, and we brought it to Turner Television. At that time, Ted Turner was still very active running the company. He heard about the project, and he brought us in and said, I love this story, I love you guys, but I've always wanted to tell the story of Frederick Douglass since I was a boy. So he commissioned Charles and me to do Frederick Douglass. And that project continues to this day. I mean, this is more of a Hollywood writing saga, but Charles did a beautiful series of screenplays off that commission. We worked on them together. They never got produced. We subsequently went to HBO and got this close to getting it produced there. And then it went to Sony and Columbia in about 2012, and it is still under development to this day. I'm literally at home working on a new treatment of Douglass for an independent project. Former President Obama, in his new life as a many-faceted creator, also has a Frederick Douglass project underway with the Yale historian David Blight, who won the Pulitzer for his biography of Douglass last year. So there's a lot of ferment around Frederick Douglass, but in my case, my interest and involvement on the film side goes back to this remarkable work that really changed what they call the canon of American history about emancipation and Reconstruction that came out of that very productive era of new history with, as I mentioned, Foner and the CUNY scholars, and now it's sort of accepted new interpretation of what happened during Reconstruction. So I put some readings at the bottom of this long list of clips for those who might be interested in what we were doing with emancipation and Reconstruction. What I found so remarkable out of my experience in community organizing is that a lot of the urge for what was called community control and the early expression of Black power had a lot of the same markings of what we found in these 19th century documents about what freedom meant to the freed as people went about creating their own communities and going from slavery literally overnight to freedom and to shaping their new lives. They were very kind of modest and humble American democratic impulses. Have a family, have a farm, maybe start a business, etc. And of course, the response of the white South once they regrouped was fierce counter-revolution, you could argue, to the revolution of the real Reconstruction, and the Ku Klux Klan emerged and informal forms of violence against Black activism, Black business success, and so forth. But what the new history was telling us is that both impulses were going on. There was this impulse to create the new community, and then this terrible backlash that effectively crushed it and carried on through the 19th century in Jim Crow and ultimately in segregation, and Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that essentially said that African American people do not have standing. And we're still struggling with it to this day. Just an anecdote that ties together with RASPAD. We opened in LA at the Laemmle theaters on the weekend of the Rodney King riots. So of course we got kind of overwhelmed. But my Ukrainian friends, they wanted to go down into Koreatown in downtown LA and work on the cleanup. I mean, they had this sort of citizen, and they did. We went down to, I mean, they didn't care that our opening was sort of overwhelmed by the riot, and one of the first Black Lives Matter events of that 1992 period. The point, I guess, as as a filmmaker, producer, these projects like RASPAD, if once you get involved with them, they're very tricky and complicated to make in production terms and financing and distribution, all the kind of stuff we associate with putting a film out into the world. But we also recognize that this is that we were really fortunate to have this opportunity to work on a film like that, and part of that brought a kind of sense of obligation to try to bring a film like that to audiences that, like the Sierra Club or the Union of Concerned Scientists or Physicians for Social Responsibility. We collaborated with all of them on screenings and events in which we could sort of join the concern about the nuclear energy issue with ecological and environmental issues. So from start to finish, a project like that can involve 3-4 years, and you don't get paid for stuff like that, but it's part of the privilege, really, of being part of such a courageous and meaningful enterprise.
Film is has such an ability to bring people together and talk about issues, and it's it is.
I would sort of connect that to a bunch of clips that are also here on your list. I worked on a film called 13 Days, which was our take on the Cuban Missile Crisis. That project began in 1996 when a colleague of mine had this idea that as part of the year 2000 that we should try to do a batch of films that spoke to great issues of the century. And one of them was the missile crisis, the point at which the world came closest to nuclear confrontation. And so 1996 we began trying to think of ways that we could develop a story that legitimately brought us inside the rooms where all the negotiation over on the US side were going on, to try to come up with a policy to respond to the fact of Soviet missiles in Cuba. And it took us 4 years and various failed attempts at scripts, and finally we did get one together that is the one that we ultimately made.
You know, last summer I read a book, The Guns of August. I wish every man on that blockade line read that book. It's World War I. It's 13 million killed. It was all because the militaries of both alliances believed they were so highly attuned to one another's movements and dispositions, they could predict one another's intentions. But all the theories were based on the last war. And the world and technology had changed, and those lessons were no longer valid. But it was all they knew, so the orders went out. Couldn't be rescinded. And your man in the field, his family at home, they couldn't even tell you the reasons why their lives were being destroyed. But why couldn't they stop it? What could they have done? Here we are 50 years later. I think one of their ships resists the inspection. And we shoot out its rudder and board. They shoot down one of our planes in response. So we bombed their anti-aircraft sites in response to that. They attacked Berlin. So we invade Cuba. And they fire their missiles. And we fire ours.
That speech is taken from the taped transcripts of the Kennedy White House. I mean, it's what really happened. He said all that. I've heard it, and so in our approach to the telling that story, we tried to depend as much as possible on the written record, although obviously we dramatized it and it was a big Hollywood movie, Kevin Costner, blah, blah, blah. But he was a genuine producing partner on it and insisted on sticking as close to the record as we could.
Hail him again. I want you to try him again.
We are kidding ourselves.
Your coordinates for the Pierce? Pierce coordinates, 25 degrees, 30 minutes north, 78 degrees, 10 minutes west.
Destroyer Pierce, Соединенные Штаты Америки. Прием. Грозный, 22 Destroyer Pierce, Соединенных Штатов Америки. Прием. Not responding, Chief.
Tell the skipper.
They're not responding, sir.
04, 04, all hands back your battle stations. All hands back your battle stations.
Very well. Load your guns.
Guns are loaded, sir.
What was that, Admiral? We've been hailing the Grozny for the last hour, Mr. Secretary. The Grozny refuses to stop.
What are you doing?
Carrying out our mission, Mr. Secretary. Now, if you don't mind, we're very busy right now. We need to be able to do our job.
Admiral, I asked you a question.
We're going to follow the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement which the President has approved and signed in his order of 23 October. Yes. Yes, you may proceed, Captain. Clear your guns.
Damn it! Stop that firing!
What?
Stop that firing!
Ceasefire! Ceasefire!
God help us. That ship was firing star shells. What? Star shell flares, Mr. Secretary. God damn it, I've got a job to do here.
Now, you've been camped out there since Monday night. You're tired, you're exhausted,
You're making mistakes.
you interfere with me and you will get some of my men killed, and I will not allow that.
Star shells.
Get out of our way, Mr. Secretary. The Navy's been running blockade since the days of John Paul Jones.
I believe the President made it clear that there would be no firing on ships without his express permission.
With all due respect, Mr. Secretary, we were not firing on that ship.
What the hell was that?
Firing on a ship means attacking a ship. We were not attacking that ship. We were firing over it.
That was not the President's intention when he gave that order. What if the Soviets don't see the distinction? What if they make the same mistake I just made? There will be no firing anything near any Soviet ships without my express permission. Now, is that understood, Admiral? Is it?
Yes, sir.
And I will only issue such instructions when ordered to by the President. John Paul Jones. You don't understand a thing, do you, Admiral? This isn't a blockade. This is language. A new vocabulary, the likes of which the world has never seen. This is President Kennedy communicating with Secretary Khrushchev.
We probably need to be bringing this to a close, but that kind of confrontation, the issues, the idea that communication, even at the height of potential war, where the slightest misreading, the slightest misstep could provoke a nuclear reaction. We again, while this was shown in theaters and so forth, we spent an extra 2 years bringing the film to Congress, to Council on Foreign Relations, to the UN, to the Annenberg School at USC and Oxford and all over, and eventually to Havana, where Castro hosted us for a screening. at his screening room in the presidential palace. And the idea was that if a film is, spending all these millions to tell this story, in this case, as accurately and truthfully as we could, again, we wanted to get it out into discussion beyond the Hollywood promotion distribution strand, and present it to policy and media and students and scholars for discussion as it might be useful dealing with this kind of crisis. And when you look, I think you and I were talking about the Guns of August scene, when you hear that and hear about the missteps, and you mentioned, this could have been Iran, and a colleague of mine made that point today in writing about the significance of that scene and in the way decisions are made at the highest level. They could fly out of hand so easily, and Kennedy was the kind of guy, for all of his flaws as a president or leader, who had the experience of a guy who fought, who was in the Navy, and as he himself said, the hard hats, the brass, they don't really know necessarily what's going on, and have to sort of stand up to their pressure because they're looking to fight, because that's what they do. Anyway, that kind of story is part of what I've had the great good fortune to be part of in some of these projects we're talking about, and look forward to continuing both in my work that Maud Olson and the GWC is helping support, just by making it so comfortable to work here, and to try to keep refining these stories and making them worthy of getting financial support and getting produced.
Well, Peter, we're happy to have you here, and wow, what a amazing career you've had, from a community organizer. Is that where it started in New Haven? I'm just curious about some of that.
Yeah.
Your beginnings there.
Mm-hmm.
New Haven is a pretty interesting town. I used to live in Springfield, so I come down to New Haven often for stuff. And
well, it was I worked in a neighborhood in New Haven called the Hill, which was where in New Haven the Black Power movement and the Panthers originated, and it was also a very productive, very confrontational moment, and very difficult moment. And the theme was community control, and they challenged the city leadership. They wanted to have a say in how education policy was created, how the schools ran, how housing was thought of and built, and neighborhood resources like parks. And it was a very, very exciting moment. It's where the New Haven riot happened in '67. So I saw a lot of that kind of contemporary history unfold there. And as I mentioned, when 20 years later I got exposed to all this new history, it sort of had this echo of the calls I heard on the ground for community control and involvement, and pushing back against police pressure, against and for an active voice in their say. And it's truly what I found in Ukraine. When these filmmakers and other independence movement advocates there, they were making the same point. They wanted their voice to be heard, and it's a long, patient, difficult struggle. But that was my New Haven was my first exposure to it before I shifted more into TV journalism, filmmaking that I've been describing.
Well, as a place that whose mission, the Gloucester Writers Center, is to bring out diverse voices, we're very happy to have had your voice here at the Maud Olson Library, and we will.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We'll put this on our website.
Okay.
And it'll be there for other people to check in. And I hope that everybody out there enjoyed the evening. We're going to try to do more of these.
Can I throw in
go ahead.
An Olson coda from
Yes.
my favorite Olson? It's called Maximus to Himself. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but it's under number 2 stanza. It reads, "It is undone business I speak of this morning, with the sea stretching out for my feet."